Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar to launch this report, Floresta 250 by Global Canopy. And now, my name is Jaciele. I'll be the moderator of this event today. And before we introduce the panelists and start discussing the topics that we're going to address today, I'd like to go through some housekeeping rules. So this is a bilingual event, and you can choose to listen in the original language. All panelists will be speaking in Portuguese, or you could select interpretation to listen in English if you prefer to do so. If you prefer to listen to interpretation, please select the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select the language that you prefer to listen in that case, English. This session will be recorded, so if you miss any details, we'll be sharing the recording very soon on the Global Canopy website. Our event will last for an hour, and each panelist will have about 5 minutes for the initial remarks, and then we'll start the discussion and we'll open also for questions from the audience. And you can submit your questions and comments at any time during the event using the Q&A box that's available for the event or through the chat box, as you prefer. We are considering that we might be able to answer perhaps 3 to 4 questions. So if your specific question is not answered, please feel free to get in touch with us via email, and we'll do our best to answer your question via email. Well, I was about to start introducing our panelists for today and welcoming our participants. Jaciele Davi, who is Senior Conservation Analyst at WWF-Brasil. She's a lawyer with expertise in environmental law and also an expert in environment and sustainability from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo. We also have Isadora Carvalho, who is Head for Sustainable Finance Engagement at Global Canopy. She's a biologist and also an expert in environmental management and ecological economy with a degree from the University of São Paulo. We'll also have with us Mr. Raoni Rajan, who is the Director for Deforestation and Fire Control Policies at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. He's a professor of social studies in science and technology at the Production Engineering Department at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And finally, Alice Tumult, who is Executive Director for Centro da Vida Institute, ICV. She led the development of solutions for deforestation control and mitigation of climate change, working together with different stakeholders in the public and private sectors. So on behalf of Global Canopy, I thank you very much for your presence here today. And we'd like to start with a brief analysis of the situation, the context about deforestation in finance before we start sharing the results and the findings of Floresta 250 cattle. So first question for Jaciele. Jaciele, how do you see the context for deforestation-free finance in Brazil? Well, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you everyone at Global Canopy for the invitation. Well, we are getting to the end of 2024 and about to start 2025, which is a key year for conservation. And WWF Brazil, as Global Canopy, we pay a lot of attention to value chains, and we recognize that the financial sector plays a key role in these chains, considering institutional investors and major investments for companies that are involved in the businesses, trading and selling agro-commodities. But a lot of this investment comes from overseas, but there is a significant group in the Brazilian financial sector that are playing an important role in this regard. And that includes the banking system as well through the concession of credit. So WWF Brazil and my team, in our role as maintaining this dialogue between the public and private sectors, we believe that there's still a lot to do in this area. So we have a long journey ahead of us, considering the financial institutions in Brazil. We believe that there's still a lack of public commitments and more concrete targets in the area of deforestation by these institutions, and also a more concrete and closer engagement with companies in this industry. So financial institutions alone, they can do a lot, but they cannot do everything on their own. So they can and may use their role as investors and do that to leverage the strategies and the needs that Brazil has in terms of zeroing deforestation and increasing public commitments in this area. So there's still a lot to be done. However, in the recent past, we've seen important advances in this sector, such as, for example, the number of coalitions that we've seen arise, and the number of public commitments and sectoral commitments in the financial sector and involving the financial sector. There's some asset managements and institutional investors that are more vocal in their engagement with the companies where they invest. So there's been progress, but there's still a lot to be done. So what we'd like to see in terms of the change that we'd like to see is that more and more these commitments were made and that practical promises and commitments, they were also met, and the targets were more ambitious. And this report that's being launched today, Floresta 250 cattle, it's very helpful for us. It's going to help us monitor these commitments and also monitor the progress of the private sector and the financial sector in this regard. And WWF, as an organization that is working in this area, would like to celebrate the launch of this report and the efforts made by Global Canopy towards this goal. So these are my initial considerations, that considering the engagement of the sector and working together with the private sector, in dialogue with the private sector, we may be able to help turn these words into actions and make sure that these efforts bear fruit. So I'd like to thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity and celebrate together the launch of Floresta 250. Thank you, Jaciele. I'd like to invite now Isadora to talk briefly about the new data that Floresta 250 cattle is presenting today. Thank you, Isadora. The floor is yours. Thank you, Cynthia. It's a pleasure for me to be working to be here together with such important people to launch the report. And before I start speaking, I wonder if we have the results of the quiz, so that we have an idea of what people responded. So when we think when we asked about how much percent of deforestation caused by pastures in Brazil, the answer was 60%. So 60% of deforestation related to that takes place in Brazil. And we know, within our bubble, that Brazil has committed to stopping deforestation by 2030. So we have a long way ahead of us and in a very short period of time. And that's why it's so important for us to continue engaging in these discussions so that we can indeed reach our targets. And when we think about out of the 75 financial institutions that were assessed under Floresta 250, how many of these institutions have commitments related to critical human rights issues? And the answer was 0. No financial institution out of the 75 that we studied are engaged or working in the area of human rights. So I feel sad about this result, but it's a fact. And I'd like to ask my colleagues to start sharing their slides so that we can start talking about the results of the presentation or the study. Thank you. So before we actually start talking about Floresta 250, I think it'd be good to talk a little bit about what Global Canopy stands for. So Global Canopy is a not-for-profit organization that is data-driven, and our goal is to increase transparency and accountability in the market regarding its impacts on nature. So we provide open access data and tools and insights and guidance to financial institutions, companies, governments, and civil society, with the aim of supporting all these actors in their decision-making processes, and that they can take informed decisions about nature, forests, and people. We also know that there's no solution to the climate crisis without addressing deforestation. So the cattle segment is one of the main drivers of global deforestation. And a large part of this deforestation, 60% of all cattle-related deforestation, takes place in Brazil. So engaging with these companies and financial institutions that are involved in this sector, this would help us achieve our goals towards zero deforestation. And benefiting from this experience, this knowledge, and the specific context of cattle raising and the cattle sector in Brazil, in this context, Global Canopy is launching a Floresta 250 cattle, which is a new data offering that will help us address deforestation in this regional context with a specific focus on Brazil. And this initiative has assessed the performance of 175 companies and 75 financial institutions across the globe that have a stronger influence on deforestation in Brazil, driven by the cattle supply chains, including beef and leather. So these institutions and companies, they are assessed based on the strength and the achievement of their commitments related to deforestation, ecosystem degradation, and associated human rights abuses. So this we see this as a baseline. So our goal is to have a snapshot of how these 175 companies and 75 financial institutions, how they are performing today regarding deforestation. And for next year, around the time of COP30, we plan to launch a second assessment scoring and ranking these institutions and organizations. And we expect these organizations to have made some progress towards the targets and the milestones of COP30. And COP30, as we know, they put deforestation as a central aspect of our climate crisis. And the data that we have verified, they show that these companies that have assessed and studied, they're failing to implement policies to fight deforestation. When we analyze companies alone, 83% of all companies studied, they did not or have not published deforestation conversion commitments for the cattle supply chains. And this is not very different when we look at financial institutions. Out of the 75 financial institutions that we assessed, 80% have not yet published a deforestation policy for cattle products. Next, please. It's important to point out that commitments are not sufficient alone. They are a first step towards best practices. So sharing transparent results about a specific commodity and its impacts, this is key for us to do something about it. But we still have a long way ahead of us when you consider what has to be done in this sector. 88% of the companies assessed for the beef sector, they have not disclosed any volume as being free from deforestation and conversion. And 91% of the companies that are being assessed for leather, they follow the same pattern. Next slide, please. So this slide here is a snapshot of the financial flows going towards these 175 companies being assessed. So the bars in blue, they come from international financial institutions that are directly financing these companies that are more exposed to deforestation. So it's a significantly larger volume when we compare these results with those bars in red, which are the financial institutions based in Brazil. And this is very much in line with what we heard from Jaciele. We see that there's an allocation of capital coming mainly from overseas, but there is a growing flow involving Brazilian financial institutions. So this gives us an insight that not only Brazilian capital, but also international capital is exposed to deforestation in Brazil, linked to the cattle chain. Now, if we have a more, let's say, a closer look at financial institutions and how they perform, only 8% they have a process to engage with companies, and 6% of these financial institutions require companies to have a traceability mechanism in place. So it's a very low number. It's too low when we consider that they are basic practices for us to have a reach and to reach supply chains without the risk of deforestation. And deforestation is not related to environmental impacts alone. So deforestation is closely linked with human rights abuses. And this is another relevant indicator that is highlighted by the study, is that companies and financial institutions, they tend to ignore human rights in their operations and human rights abuses in their operations. When we look at the companies, only 3 out of 175 have a publicly available commitment related to human rights abuses. And when we look at financial institutions, not a single one out of the 75 that we studied have a human rights policy that is publicly available. So when, nowadays, nature and deforestation, they are at the center of everyone's attention. So up to not too long ago, we talked only about climate, but now we're talking about nature and deforestation a lot. But I think the good news is that for the first time in Belém, we'll have a COP at the heart of the Amazon forest. So we have a practical pathway that is guiding our action with companies and financial institutions. The other piece of good news is that there is a solution for this crisis. When we look at companies, there are some basic steps that that must be taken so that we can leverage ambition in this sector. What are these steps? First of all, companies should assess their exposure, understand their risks, understand where they're exposed to deforestation risks. They should also publish their commitments related to fighting deforestation. And they should start engaging with their suppliers. In other words, bringing the whole supply chain towards the idea of implementing best practices. And the same applies to financial institutions. And financial institutions have the power to influence change and to shape good practices. So those financial institutions that are taking their first steps by COP30, they should at least publicly recognize the risks in their operations. They should conduct a risk assessment in their portfolios, and they should rank their customers and their partners in terms of high risk and low risk companies. And they should also establish policies that are aimed at reaching zero deforestation and reaching deforestation-free portfolios. So not having data, not having clarity, not having visibility, these arguments are no longer acceptable. The deforestation agenda and the forest agenda, we have a lot of data available both for companies and financial institutions. So there's no justification that will that might justify this absence of action. So it's a practical agenda. It's a viable agenda through open access data. And we're here, our arms are open to try to drive this agenda forward. And this is a presentation. Actually, it's just a snapshot of the baseline assessment that is presented through Floresta 250. So we have more data available that are available at our website, floresta.org, where you can also download the full report. The full report is already available on the website, and you can visualize not only the highlights that we shared with you today, but also the full data of the study regarding the main insights that we found through our study. And the version in Portuguese will be launched very soon on our website. And this is it. We're here available to address any questions or any doubts that you might have. And thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Isadora, for having summarized such a detailed diagnostic. And I'm sure that our participants will be able to access more details on the website, and also for the recommendations that you presented here. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Raoni to talk about the role of companies and financial institutions regarding deforestation in the cattle chain. Thank you, Ronnie. Well, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Global Canopy, for the invitation. I would like to start by sharing a number with you. It will help us understand the size of this effort. So since early last year, we've been working very hard in terms of trying to relaunch our deforestation policies. And that means a lot of field work, a lot of embargoes, a lot of penalties as well, and engage in the financial sector as well. But considering the embargoes that IBAMA has implemented, only 23% of the area under embargo has shown some evidence of natural regeneration. In other words, in the vast majority of cases, we have evidence that, 77% of the cases, we have evidence that there's still some agricultural activity in these areas. Because, if you know the Amazon, you know how deforestation works there. A deforested area will regenerate naturally after a few years. So this means that there's still a lot of illegal activity taking place in these areas. And these cattle that are there in these pastures and the grains that are being produced in the Amazon, they're being financed by someone. And the cows, they're not just dying of old age, they're being sold to someone. So if we don't integrate our efforts together with the private sector, it's very hard for the government alone to reach zero deforestation. So that's the first realization, which is very important for us to have. And we started working in this regard. And I think an important step that we took was to strengthen the rules for rural credit. So since 2008, there's a restriction on providing credit to properties under embargo, but it hasn't been applied. So under the rule, farmers would just need to present a statement saying, well, there's no embargo on my farm, and they would be able to access credit. Since 2017, we started crossing data, working together with the central bank and other institutions. And we started vetoing credit concession within a polygon in areas that were under embargo by IBAMA. And then an important measure that was introduced then was that the Environmental Rural Registry that was the official, let's say, tool for us to know whether a given property was under embargo or not. And in the past, there was a possibility, for example, for an agricultural property to be within permanent preservation area or an indigenous land and still have access to credit. And now through the data that we have, these properties, these farms, when they are within a protected area, they cannot have access to credit from the financial sector, and in particular from public banks. And as a result of that, we managed to reduce deforestation significantly, and working together with the financial institutions. But we still need to do a lot in this regard, despite the advances that we've seen, in particular regarding the cattle segment. And we need more data. We need better data. And there's also the discussion on individual accessibility. But there's a lot of data. There are a lot of data available. And if we know, for example, that today the Public Prosecutor's Office, they have been carrying audits, transparent audits, and any funding institution, any client, they have access to this information and they can find out the level of compliance of the main slaughterhouses in the country. Does that reflect into lower interest rates today? Does that reflect into better market decisions? Well, there's something that we need to ask ourselves. But for example, in the case of the state of Pará, we also have solutions that are available online today. Today, in the state of Pará, in the state of Minas Gerais, we're talking about 1,400,000 properties. It is possible to find out online whether a specific property is involved in deforestation or not. And this data is already, we have to ask ourselves whether this data that is available, whether we are using that in the best possible way. And if it's not being used, we have to ask ourselves whether that information will actually change the way that we work. So we need to start discussing that, how to better use the information that we have and the evidence that we have, instead of waiting for a solution that will never come and that actually delays implementation of actions that are so necessary for us to reach zero deforestation. Thank you. Thank you, Raoni, for showing us there's still a lot to be done. And now, linking to what you've just said, I have a more specific question for Alice regarding this. And the question is, what are the main challenges for the private sector in this context? Well, thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. I'd like to say it's a great pleasure for me to be here with Global Canopy. I admire Global Canopy a lot. And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about where I am and where I'm speaking from. So I work in the state of Mato Grosso. I have worked in Mato Grosso for the past 20 years, and the focus of my work is basically transparency and fighting deforestation and commitments involving different actors. And I do that from the ICV, the Center of Life Institute. And it's an organization that's been operating in the state of Mato Grosso for the past 33 years and 20 years in the Amazon alone. So we have legitimacy to speak about that. And our work is based on data. And so our work, as I said, is based on data, but also we also base our work on partnerships. And we understand that solutions, they are not ICV solutions. They are solutions that have to be built and developed together with farmers and society. It has to be a collective construction. And in addition to being an organization that I'm very proud of working with, I'm very happy also to work in the state of Mato Grosso, because we see Mato Grosso as a lab for developing solutions in this regard. If you don't know, from 8 to 10% of all soybean produced in the world comes from Mato Grosso. A large proportion of cattle raising in Brazil comes from Mato Grosso. And people know Mato Grosso about this because of agriculture. But Mato Grosso is also an important state for its forest, for its water resources, its traditional populations. And we also have 45 different indigenous peoples living in the state of Mato Grosso with different cultures, different languages, different ethnicities. And we indeed in the eye of the tornado uh, of the climate crisis. So we have a very strong agricultural sector, but at the same time, we are striving to keep the forest standing. And as we said earlier, we know that 60% of the deforested areas in the state of Mato Grosso, they become pastures. And this is a type of a cattle approach that's extensive. There's no investment, no technology. And basically, we're talking about a cycle of poverty and severe social issues that are related to this and are impacting on the forest. And what Roni said, it reminds us that we are seeing progress towards addressing one type of deforestation. And we can see that such arrangements, together with the central bank and the command and control work that's being done, is also very important. But it's also true that the Forest Code lacks proper interpretation and implementation sometimes. And although there is a lot of engagement today, we, in the public sector, we need to engage the private sector more. And I'd like to end my initial remarks by saying that today in the forest, when you consider the forest, there is an ideological approach to this, and it's important to recognize this. And for example, this webinar here with an international audience, it would be good if companies and investors, they recognize their need to make commitments. And this is what Floresta 250 shows. Recently, a new piece of legislation was enacted in the state of Mato Grosso, which actually weakened the soy moratorium, but which is in a way guiding most of deforestation control agreements. So it's not only about seeking further commitment and engagement from actors outside Mato Grosso, but also the recognition that these agreements can only exist if there's a strong stance, a strong position from the state of Mato Grosso to try to remove ideology from the discussion and from the dealings. So we need to have a strong private sector, a strong financial sector that plays their role in this. And when I see it, when I look at some of the results that are shared with us, I feel concerned because that only 10% or less are doing what is expected of them, and more than 80% are not. Well, thank you very much, Alice. Well, having heard the four of you, actually, I have a question I'd like to address to the whole panel, to all of you. And then after that, we can open to more questions. Now, thinking about COP30 in Brazil, the whole world will be thinking about this. And this report is being published at the end of a very difficult year. So my question to you is, what would you like to see happen in 2025, considering all the attention that will be given to this topic and during COP30 in Brazil? And what kind of progress would you like to see in this regard? So if you could just say a few words about how you see 2025 and the whole attention that Brazil is going to attract from the whole world. I'd like to thank you. If you could just say a few words about this. So following the same order that we used before, Jaciele, you could start perhaps. Well, thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Well, as a representative of the third sector, our expectation is that we may be able to reduce this dispute of narratives at COP30 so that it doesn't become a stage for ideological discussions and disputes with opposing views, and we'll try to converge towards some sort of agreement for the benefit of all. That's our initial expectation. And secondly, as Alicia said, we are going through a period where some of the achievements that we have made in the area of sustainability, uh, we see that some of these achievements may be at risk, or they may be flexibilized. And we'd like, therefore, to see the financial sector and companies assuming the responsibilities uh, so that we can reach deforestation or zero deforestation in Brazil, and also find a solution for climate change mitigation. So during COP30, the Amazon will be in the spotlight, but it's not only the Amazon. We also need to talk more about the Cerrado. So the Cerrado is a biome that has been exploited and deforested in recent years, and and we need to talk more about the Cerrado and the Mato Piba region, the states of Maranhão, Tocantins, Bahia, and Piauí. So in summary, this is what we think. COP30 will be an important stage for us to discuss all these issues, but we need to be careful to make sure that the spotlight will be on the most important priorities. So the Amazon, of course, especially considering the soy moratorium, but the Cerrado biome also needs to be given the proper importance and in the light of global goals. Isadora, what would you like to say about that? How do you view COP30 and how will that play out for us? Well, I believe that we need to be we have to have it very clear that COP30 will not make all our problems go away as in a piece of magic. Uh, I see, lots of people thinking, well, by November next year, everything will be solved because we'll have COP30 in Brazil. It won't happen like that. But what we need to recognize, and this is something that the study is very good at providing, is this snapshot of where we are and where we want to go. So COP30, if we consider what happened also at COP16 here, which happened in Latin America, it enables us to talk about nature, deforestation, and the bioeconomy. So I want to see actions. I think commitments are important. I think it's evidence of, let's say, good faith. And institutions, when they make a commitment, they're showing their good faith. But we need to see implementation, and we need coordinated, concerted action, bringing together the private sector and the governments with a very clear role for all different actors, and everyone can understand how these roles are being played. And therefore, we need transparency, and we need to understand what's being done so that we can prioritize those that are leading on this agenda, but also to welcome beginners or novices on board. But I truly believe that it's not going to be a magical week that will solve all our problems. Between now and COP30, there's still a lot of action that has to take place, that has to be coordinated with the involvement of the private sector, with a clear understanding of what the private sector's role will be, and that we can no longer keep that discourse. I'm interested in that. We would like to do that. No, it's we have to start acting, not only speaking. Thank you, Isadora. Isadora talked a lot about the need to implement what we have already in terms of agreements and commitments. And the first signs that Brazil has been giving about Brazil's priorities for COP30 is they are related to that, about transforming those commitments into results. So, Roni, how do you see COP30 from that perspective? Because we know that that's an important piece of information. Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Well, COP30 will give, let's say, special emphasis on forest protection, not only in Brazil, but all over the world. So we see it as a moment for us to consolidate best practices and build on other activities that are taking place already, because we have seen the nefarious effects of dismantling public policy. So public policies, they are a tool. It's just like the internet that we're using now. We only realize there's a problem when it stops working. So similarly, all these public institutions, not only the Environment Ministry, but also the other ministries and other institutions working together, um, they they are important, and it's important for us to consolidate and recognize that. And we also need to do more regarding deforestation in supply chains. We have to recognize that we're not talking about the whole agricultural production. So if you consider Brazil as a whole, we're talking about 20% of the production. Only 2.6% of all farms and rural properties in Brazil, they have some sort of deforestation that's not in line with the law since 2008. So it's a small fraction, but that has a strong impact on the climate, not only regional climate, but also global climate. So we need to advance in that regard. And we also need to recognize the important role that Brazil has to play as COP president to address and reach a final solution on a number of areas, such as just transition, and also advance in a number of different mechanisms, such as, for example, those mechanisms to pay for conserved areas. And this will generate sustainable funding and financing for other countries, not only for Brazil. And they need solutions to make sure that this sector will enable us to reach zero deforestation, especially, we've considered, when we reach zero deforestation, REDD+ funds and others won't be available anymore. So this is what we want from COP30. Thank you, Roni. And now to end this first round of questions, Alice, how do you see COP30? Will that be an opportunity for us to do more? Well, Cynthia, I share Isadora's opinion that, I'm a bit tired of hearing COP30 being mentioned as a magical solution. Sometimes I forget that the Amazon forest it continues to be a territory under dispute. So we have different understandings and different views of the world about what the environment is, and how ideology plays a key role in that. So whether or not we like it, these spotlights, these events, they are necessary, they are important. And as Roni has said, we know what legal and illegal deforestation is. We know where deforestation is taking place. So we have that information available. And events such as COP30, they are useful because they help people take a stance. So basically, that's the role, or an important role, for COP. It's an opportunity for important announcements to be made, and for engagements to be more public, and to reduce ambiguity. It's also very positive for us to have a study such as Floresta to 50 being launched now. So it's not 2025 yet, although many of us are hoping for 2024 to reach an end very soon. But it's an opportunity for us in 2025 to turn those actions into actions. Sorry, turn those words into actions. Make sure that the commitments, they become real results. So, and also ask ourselves what else could be announced and developed between now and copy to show that those actors, they are part of the game and they're working together with us to fight deforestation. Thank you. So I have a question here that was asked by someone in the audience. And the question is, it's about this intense participation and engagement of international financial institutions. So there's a concern about a potential negative reaction from international ESG sectors. Uh, so, in addition to those sectors that are considering the ESG agenda, do you think there might be a negative reaction from the private sector as a whole in the sense of a fear of being criticized? I don't know. This is for the whole panel as well. I don't know, Alicia, if you'd like to start answering on that. Well, I always ask myself whether this divide between Brazil and international, whether this in itself might not be a problem, because sometimes we talk about blended finance. So there's different types of financing and different actors engaged in financing. So here in Mato Grosso, we have many players who are headquartered elsewhere. JBS, for example, is a Brazilian company that has assets in many different countries. So sometimes I feel a bit uneasy about talking about creating this distinction between Brazilian and international funding institutions and whether or not this is related to ideology. And this is also it's about looking at a glass and asking yourself whether it's half full or half empty. So Brazil has a lot of data, a lot of possibilities, and I think we need to stress that to show that Brazil is a place where a commitment or an expression well developed will make a difference because we have all the tools available. At the same time, it's an opportunity for us to show that the problems still exist. So finding the right dosage, the right recipe is not easy, but I think if we use common sense, we can do it. Thank you. We still have about 10 minutes before we close the event. So I'd like to ask the other panelists to also address the same aspects, the risks for the private sector. And after that, there's a specific question to Raoni. Well, thank you, Cynthia. I'm a bit divided. I feel a bit divided because although there's some skepticism from some of these private companies, especially in the US, if we look at the level of maturity and how some sustainable finance criteria are being developed, I believe the financial institutions have to be more open about adopting best practices. In particular, when we look at the cattle industry, uh, I think when we talk about this, I believe that some financial institutions, they're still trying to understand how this connects to the climate. Okay, I cannot generalize when I'm talking about some financial institutions. And, we are here in the regional context, sharing the same space. So we cannot generalize. I think there might be some skepticism and I think there's a risk of being contaminated by ideology. it is true. But I think there's a very close scrutiny by civil society and by the governments as well. So having some skepticism is okay, but it shouldn't go too far. That's my perception. I think at some point, the private sector, both companies and financial institutions, they'll have to give up this skepticism and start acting. Thank you. I agree with what Isadora said. I also, I'm also concerned about this, but I'd like to add one factor here. In fact, the international financial sector has, let's say, it started moving earlier than here in Brazil. So in a way, it's more mature. So they started evaluating their portfolios and started joining initiatives, coalitions, etc. This is a fact. However, I think we still lack concreteness in this engagement. In other words, putting these commitments into practice, turning words into actions. So that's one factor. The second factor is that, if you have that segmented approach, the companies have an ESG department, a sustainability department. I think it's a lack of ambition. It's a lack of understanding of reality where they do not see, for example, human rights and social issues as something that's part of the core business of the companies. So we have to stop looking at ESG and the environment as a side aspect, as something that's not involved in everything that the company does. So sometimes, it's valued, sometimes it's prioritized, but when there's a crisis and when it's no longer profitable to pay more attention to ESG, for example, it's abandoned. So we see that, for example, in some situations due to humanitarian issues or crises or wars, sustainability is shifted to one side, and it's not something that you can just give up on simply because there's a crisis. And just adding to a comment that I saw in the chat box, if we change the political context, there is a fear that companies in the financial sector may stop looking at sustainability and risk and deforestation and start prioritizing that because the political context might become more conservative, and they might be more involved in denialism and not accepting climate the climate crisis as a reality. And I think what we want to see is to maintain this importance and the relevance of looking at what good land use is and the responsibility and accountability of all members of the value chain. And this is something that we need to maintain and continue investing our energy in, and that it should not change depending on the context. It should be part of the core of what we're doing. Otherwise, if the environment is not at the center, we won't have a fair society, we won't have a healthy society, and as a result, countries will not have a good economic development. So basically, this is what I'd like to say. Well, thank you. And finally, Roni, I'd like to ask, in addition to this one, I'd like to ask an additional question about this potential negative reaction of the private sector. I'd like to ask specifically about this traceability initiative in the state of Pará, whether people are taking up that initiative, and if you could comment on that briefly, and then we'll close our event after that. Thank you. Well, thank you, Cynthia. Well, the private sector is very heterogeneous. So there's a significant part of the private sector that would like to attract more funds to Brazil. And they don't do that because of the perceived social environmental risks. And if we think that deforestation has dropped 45% in the past couple of years, in spite of that, there's still deforestation. So we have to take that into account. And we have the other let's say, part of the private sector that have been very cautious about this. So if company A adopts, let's say, more concrete measures and they start buying, let's say, cattle because of their unsustainable practices, and company B starts buying that cattle, then there's an imbalance there. And therefore, that's why agreements in this area are important for some to make sure that there's a level playing field. In the specific case of Pará, I would like to mention the audits that were carried out by the Public Prosecutor's Office in the past 10 years with a lot of accumulated experience and knowledge. And my understanding is that despite the availability of data and the possibility of this full traceability, so 100% of all farms, they know whether they're buying cattle that is linked to deforestation or not. In spite of all this data available, the actual use of this data regularly is still limited. So perhaps we should invest more energy, not in developing new data, creating new data, but using the data that is available there. And that's in a way linked to the rules that have been created for the financial sector about creating data. And there's a whole discussion about what sensitive data could be provided and shared with the private sector and financial institutions. And these are side discussions. And actually, what's important for us here is to have information and to make sure that decisions are taken based on that information. And where information is lacking, it's important to develop that information. So, for example, today it's safer to invest in the state of Pará than in other states where there's no transparency. So it is a fact that the more information, the more transparency you have, the better it is to attract companies. And I think we need to engage in this discussion about how to make the best use possible of the data that we have. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's funny how, time is always too short when the discussion is interesting, but we need to end. I'd like to thank you very much for your participation, in particular, not only the attendees, but also our panelists in particular. I'd like to congratulate once again Global Canopy for having produced this report. The full report is available on globalcanopy.org, and very soon the recording of this event will also be available on the website. And any other question that has not been addressed here, we are sharing our email address here in the chat box, and please feel free to get in touch with us if your question hasn't been answered, and we'll try to address the question. Before you go, there'll be a final quiz here. Please answer the quiz before you go, and thank you very much for your attention today. Good afternoon to everyone.